Good evening, everyone. Hello. Welcome to the first session of Resurrection and Reincarnation, two central Jewish teachings and their meaning for today with Dr. Nathaniel Berman. So those of you joining us here on Zoom, I will be sending out invitations to join us as panelists. That will not obligate you to do anything, but it will allow you into the room so that you can turn on your camera and share if you wish. You'll also be able to unmute yourself during times for questions, answers, possibly comments, discussion. But again, you won't have to use your microphone if you don't want to. You're of course welcome to use the chat feature here on Zoom. If you're joining us on Facebook, hi, good evening. We're glad that you're learning with us. You can put your questions and comments in the comment section directly below the video. I'll take a peek now and then to make sure that you can also be part of the conversation, even if it's a lengthier process. I'm not going to read the full description for this course because it's quite long, but I will share a bit of it. I'm very excited about this class. So the resurrection of the dead has been a core Jewish teaching, at least since Talmudic times, reincarnation for more than 7 centuries. Talmudic sages denounced as heretics those who denied bodily resurrection. So there are a lot of different topics that we're going to be getting into in this course, including the idea of soul revolutions and soul pregnancy. I think that the learning will hopefully speak for itself. Dr. Nathaniel Berman holds the Rachel Barnhagen Chair at Brown University, where he teaches in the Religious Studies Department. Nathaniel's writings and teaching span a number of disciplines. As a legal historian, his work has focused on the modern construction of the nation and religion in tandem with the international. He is the author of, among many other publications, Passion and Ambivalence, Nationalism, Colonialism, and International Law. In Jewish studies, his work has focused on classical Kabbalah, which we've been fortunate to have him teach about here a number of times, particularly the Zohar. He has taught widely in this field in the New York area, as well as at Brown. His book, Divine and Demonic in the Poetic Mythology of the Zohar, The Other Side of Kabbalah, will be published this year.
Was published in 2018.
Okay, so was published. I was going to say, I feel like this is a little out of date. Apologies. But without further ado, please, Dr. Berman.
Okay, good evening, everybody. Those of you on Zoom, those of you on Facebook. I congratulate you for braving these most daring topics. The topics that I'd say most challenge our senses of ourselves as modern rational people, and really challenge you to face what is the relationship between living in a modern society and these very fundamental, very old Jewish beliefs and Jewish teachings. I would say that our first topic, which is the resurrection of the dead, or in Hebrew, Tchiyat HaMetim, is a very, very old teaching in Judaism. It had become a fundamental part of Jewish teaching, at least as far back as the time of the Mishnah, which is in the 2nd century. It undoubtedly predates that by a while. There is some controversy about whether it is actually mentioned in the Bible. There are a couple of passages in the book of Daniel, sort of the later sections of the Bible, in which it appears or may appear. But certainly by the time of the Mishnah, the beginning of the Talmud, it becomes fundamental. In the Talmud, it almost becomes the dividing line between those who are considered normative Jews and those who are considered heretics. The second topic that we will get to in a couple of classes is about reincarnation, or gilgul neshamot, which I also like to translate. It's not my original idea, but I like the translation revolutions of the souls, which is a translation that is a few hundred years old. This teaching really comes into become a firm part of Jewish teaching with Kabbalah that begins in the late 12th century. And very quickly it becomes central to kabbalistic teachings about the soul. And by the time of the Isaac Lurianic Kabbalah, it becomes impossible to think of a kabbalistic conception of the soul that isn't intimately tied up with this vision of gilgul or reincarnation, or, as I like to put it, revolutions of the souls. So we're about to embark on this journey for 6 classes, I believe. You hardy souls out there are really going to face these deep challenges. And the reason I called the course Two Central Jewish Teachings is because these teachings have been downplayed in modern strands of Judaism, strands of Judaism that have tried to adapt to the modern world. And this ranges from modern orthodoxy all the way to more and more liberal forms of Judaism, reform, and further, really a downplaying of these teachings, a certain fear of these teachings, that they would seem to be superstitious or not compatible with the scientific worldview. And to the point where many Jews who have a more liberal education or didn't grow up in an Orthodox setting, really don't even know that these are central teachings. And it is commonly said, you commonly hear people say, well, Judaism doesn't really care about what happens after death. It's really this worldly focus. That's a common thing you hear people say. And it is true that Judaism cares about what happens in this world, but it is also true that there are several thousand years of Jewish teachings about what happens after death, including these very challenging teachings about reincarnation and resurrection. And what I hope to persuade you of, if you stick it out for our 6 sessions, what I hope to persuade you of is not for you to believe in the literal truth of these teachings, although I certainly have, that would be lovely. But what I hope to persuade you of is that these teachings have something to say about everyone's lives. And they have something to say about the self, and they have something to say about our relationship to God, and they have something to say about our relationship to history, to our ancestors, to Jewish history, to world history, to the history of the cosmos, and so forth. That these are not curiosities, they are actually central Jewish teachings, and they actually have very, very deep and profound meaning, whether or not you choose at the end of this journey together to take them literally, whatever that would mean in this context. Okay, so fasten your seatbelts, because now we're going to go into that. And we're going to start tonight with the teachings on resurrection, or Tchiat HaMetim, or revival of the dead. And I'm going to now put on a PowerPoint, because I'm a text guy, as all Jewish teachers really should be. And we're going to go through some teachings, and we have an hour, and I hope to have some time at the end to take questions and discussions. So here's my PowerPoint. Is that visible, Noah? The PowerPoint? All right, okay, great. And I'm going to, let's see, hide the floating meeting controls so you can see it all. Okay. So this is the title of the course, Resurrection and Reincarnation, Two Central Jewish Teachings and Their Meaning for Today. This image that I actually posted on Facebook is a really interesting image that maybe we'll have a chance to talk about tonight, but maybe we'll talk about a different session. It's actually from the famous Dura Europos synagogue, which is a 3rd century synagogue in Syria that only existed for a few decades before it was destroyed. And when they discovered it, I think, I'm not sure exactly when they discovered it, but not that long ago, like within the last 100 years, I believe, they found these incredible murals in this synagogue. Again, this is a Dura Europos synagogue from Syria, built in the 3rd century, and only lasted a couple of decades. And this is actually an image of the vision that Ezekiel had of the valley of dry bones, and in which God sort of orders him to prophesy, and the bones, these dry bones lying in this valley, they acquire flesh and tendons and all kinds of things, and they revive and these dead bones revive. And Ezekiel had this vision in approximately the 6th century BCE, and people have been discussing it ever since about whether it's to be understood as a vision, whether it's something that he's saying actually happened, and what its meaning is. But whatever that meaning is, I thought this image is just an astonishingly amazing image. Again, a very, very old image from the 3rd century of the Common Era. So you can contemplate that for a moment, and then we'll go into it. Let's see. There we go. Okay, I think to get us in the mood, I chose this passage to get us in the mood. I love this passage. Oops, I've always loved this passage. And the mood I want us to get into is the mood of not taking things for granted, not taking things for granted, not taking life for granted. I think that the mood of not taking things for granted is something that is important to study these topics. And I think these topics are also important for living in a way in which you appreciate things, in which you don't take things for granted. So here is this wonderful little story on a page of the Talmud that has a number of wonderful little stories about Tchiat HaMetim, or resurrection, or revival of the dead. And they all have to do with little vignettes in which some Talmudic sage tries to persuade us that this idea of revival of the dead is a deep Jewish teaching. In fact, that it has a biblical basis. Now, this is not about a biblical basis. This is really about reasoning. So it says, a heretic said to Gviha ben Psisa, which is a very interesting name, but I won't go into that. It's a very unusual and interesting name. He was a hunchback, and it's possible that his first name has something to do with that. A heretic said to Gviha ben Psisa, "Woe unto you, the wicked." So this is the heretic saying to the sage, "Woe unto you, the wicked, for you say the dead will come to life. Even those who are alive die. How can the dead possibly come to life?" So the heretic is looking at it from the perspective of, well, we know that everything alive dies. So if even the living die, then the dead, how could they come to life when actually we're mortal beings? And so Gviha ben Psisa turns it around. He responded, "Woe unto you, the wicked, for you say the dead will not come to life." And he has a different reasoning. He looks at it from the other side. If even those who were never alive come to life, right? People who were not alive before come to life when they're born. Surely those who were once alive can come to life again. He looks at it from the other angle. He says, if life can come out of non-life, surely those who are living, maybe they have a little spark of life in them, they can come to life again. He turns it around. Really depends on how you look at it, which end of the spectrum you look at it, right? And I think it's really important for not taking anything for granted, right? Not taking life for granted. I think this story really says something about the miracle that there is such a thing as life. It's the most amazing thing that life can come from non-life. And therefore, if you can accept that, which we all do because we're all walking around, then why not say those who were once alive can come to life again? And implicitly, I assume in this passage, the idea that God creates life out of non-living matter, and so that God could make life out of matter that was once living. Although it doesn't even mention God here. It just says, well, just don't take life for granted. And I love this passage. In a way, I think this passage could be like a theme for the whole course. It's about instilling a sense of wonder about life, and being attuned to that, the improbability of life. And the fact that, one could say we haven't yet discovered life on other planets probably indicates that life is very improbable. Don't take it for granted, and then who knows what could happen. If those who are never alive can come to life, surely those who were once alive can come to life again. Now, what I want to say about these Talmudic sages is, but before I get to that, let me just, I want to sit, one of the things I want to do in the course is to ask what it would be like to live in such a way that one had a consciousness of resurrection, a real consciousness of it, and reincarnation for that matter. What would it be like if we really took it seriously? And one example of that actually is something that people do very, very often in some zones of Jewish life, is that when someone commemorates a yahrzeit, there are a couple of things that people say to such a person. Sometimes they say the neshama should have an aliyah, which is an interesting thing that I don't want to go into right now. But the other thing that people say, they say ad biat hagoel, or if they say it with an Ashkenazic accent, they say ad bias hagoel, right? And what does it mean? It simply means until the coming of the Redeemer, until the coming of the Messiah. And what does that mean? It means that's when you'll see your loved one again. That's what they're saying. It's like au revoir, right? You go over to somebody who's just said Kaddish for a yahrzeit, and you said, you should have comfort until the coming of the Redeemer, when you'll see them again. And then the response, the appropriate response is, soon in our days, amen. I should see my loved one that I'm saying Kaddish for soon in our days, amen. When? On the coming of the Redeemer at the end of days. Right? And there's something that's said very, very often in some zones of Jewish life today. It's actually my favorite thing to say, that people say to me when I have yahrzeit, or that I say to other people when they have yahrzeit. It's integrated into human interaction. Have comfort at bias hagoel. And this saying, I've done a little research about this. Turns out it's fairly recent, maybe last 100, 200 years. I'm not really sure who originated it. But it, as I say, relatively recent in Jewish terms, a century or two, and yet plunges deep back into our tradition. So now it's plunged back into the tradition, into the Talmud. And you see that the people in the Talmud really lived, they really thought that this idea of the resurrection of the dead was a fundamental teaching of Judaism, and they really incorporated it into their experience of everyday life. And so here's a saying from the Babylonian Talmud. And for people who, maybe I should give a little background, the Talmud is this huge compendium of Jewish law and folklore and mysticism and theology and all kinds of things. And it's a record of discussions that went on, say, between approximately the 2nd and 6th centuries of the Common Era. So this is from and there are two Talmuds. There's a Babylonian Talmud and the Jerusalem Talmud. The Babylonian Talmud is the one more often studied. This is from Babylonian Talmud in the tractate Brachot, or Blessings. Rabbi Joshua ben Levi said, one who sees a friend after 12 months, you don't see somebody for a year, you should recite, blessed is the one who revives the dead. It's an amazing idea, right? It's the idea you don't take for granted, and don't take anything for granted. It's the miracle of seeing a friend. The miracle of seeing a friend after not seeing them for a long time. It's like the miracle of life coming from death, life coming from inorganic matter. And Rabbi Joshua ben Levi, maybe we'll get to it later in the course, had many, many interesting sayings and stories were told about him in relationship to death. He was on very intimate terms with the angel of death. If you don't see a friend for a year, you say, Baruch mechayeh metim. Blessed is one who revives the dead. Now this saying is from the other Talmud, from the Jerusalem Talmud. Another time when you say the blessing. In the school of Rabbi Yanai, they say, one who awakens from sleep must say, blessed are you, God, who revives the dead. And we're going to talk a lot more about that as we go along. Right? One who awakens from sleep must say, blessed are you, God, who revives the dead. So here are two examples of people incorporating this idea of revival of the dead into their everyday life, right? Now, somebody might say, well, they don't really mean it literally, right? Maybe that's true. Maybe it's not true. But it's an interesting thing to incorporate into the daily things that one says. You don't say, how you doing to your friend who you haven't seen for a while. You say, Baruch machayei metim. Blessed is God who revives the dead. Okay. How fundamental was the teaching in the Talmud? Very fundamental. And this is from the Mishnah. The Mishnah is this collection of mostly Jewish law, finished sometime in the 2nd century. All Israel has a share in the world to come, except one who says there is no basis for the revival of the dead in the Torah. And the Torah is not from heaven, and a heretic. So this Mishnah, very famous Mishnah, equates not believing in the revival of the dead, or at least not believing that there's a Torah basis for the idea of the revival of the dead. It equates such a person with someone who disbelieves in the divinity of the Torah, and a heretic in general, an Epicurus in general. Right? Is equated with ein Torah min hashamayim. That's how fundamental it is. That's how fundamental it is. And again, for in most strands of Judaism today, this kind of thing comes as a surprise to people. That they're viewed as believing in the Torah and believing in revival of the dead from the Torah here is equated, and the punishment for it, sort of perhaps fittingly, is if you say you don't believe in revival of the Torah, you won't have a share in the world to come. So just to give you a sense of how serious they took it, and there are some much more severe statements about people who deny the revival of the dead. I haven't included those tonight. Maybe I'll include those later. Some very, very, even much more severe punishments for such people, but maybe we'll get them later, because I want to start on a less somber note. Okay. Now, one of the things I want to do tonight is to bring to the fore some familiar prayers or sayings that are familiar to people who are immersed in Jewish life, or pray the daily liturgy. I don't expect everyone in this class to do that, but for those who do, to take some of these prayers that are familiar, take them out of obscurity, and say, look at what these really say. Now, this is a prayer, I'm going to show the English in a second. This is a prayer that is taught to children, as is the next one we'll learn. I recited it when I was a little boy, growing up as a little Orthodox boy. It comes from the Talmud, and it is an amazing thing to say. And I'm going to show you the English in a second. Those of you who are familiar with the daily liturgy know it. Those who aren't familiar with it, it's an amazing thing. So this comes from the Talmud, and it goes like this. When one awakens, and this is very much in the same spirit as that thing from the Jerusalem Talmud, in a more extended form. When one awakens, one recites the following prayer. My God, Elohai, the soul, neshama, you have placed within me as pure. You have formed it within me. You breathed it into me. You keep it within me. One day you will take it from me and restore it within me in the time to come. In other words, one day I will die. You will take my soul from me, but it will be restored to me in the time to come. That's a common way of referring to the Messianic era. Le'atid lavo is the Hebrew. As long as the soul is within me, and here it basically means as long as I'm alive, I thank you. And the word is Modeh Ani. Modeh Ani lefanecha. I thank you, or I make acknowledgement before you. Hashem, my God, God of my ancestors, Master of all worlds, Lord of all souls, blessed are you, who restores souls to dead corpses. Now, the dead corpses thing is not an exaggeration. For those of you who know a little Hebrew, the Hebrew here is machazir neshamot v'garim metim. And the word for corpses here is really a peger. It's really like a very graphic image of a corpse. Even carcass would be a possible translation. Blessed are you who restores souls to dead corpses. Now remember that this is being said upon awakening. It's being said upon awakening. Okay. So it really does equate the daily cycle of sleeping and awakening with the macro historical process of people die and then they will be revived in the Messianic era, in the time to come, the Atid Lavo. And this really quite beautiful prayer makes that analogy. And when it says who restores souls to dead corpses, it's clearly both referring to this notion that a person who sleeps is like someone who's dead. And so when you wake up in the morning, it's like your soul is being restored to a dead body, but is also clearly has a messianic idea. One day you will take it from me and restore it within me when? In the time to come, at the resurrection of the dead at the end of days. Okay, so everybody see that? And there are many things one could say about this passage. For example, and it's something I want you all to think about, is who is me in this passage? When he says, when the prayer says, one day you will take it from me, my soul, you're taking my soul from me and restore it to me in the time to come. Who is me? If I am not my soul, who am I? Who is the I that remains after the soul is taken? I don't want to answer that question now, but I just want to show that this kind of way of thinking really raises these kinds of questions about identity. Who am I? Who is the me in this passage? You keep it within me. One day you will take it from me and restore it within me in the time to come. Okay. Now here is maybe the most familiar prayer, except for the Shema, in the Jewish liturgy. And it was actually written in the 16th century by Moshe ibn Machir, who was involved with Kabbalah and the Kabbalistic circles in Tzfat and Safed. But it really is, although it's a relatively late prayer in the spectrum of Jewish history, it really does really just emerge out of these Talmudic teachings that were around 1,300 years earlier, something like that. And this is a very familiar prayer, also taught to children. I make acknowledgement before you, Modeh Ani lefanecha, living and enduring King, that you have returned my soul to me with compassion. Great is your faithfulness. And that's actually a quote from the book of Lamentations, or Echa. And this is recited, you're supposed to recite this every morning, perhaps on awakening, or the first thing when you get to the synagogue or when you do your prayers. It's taught to children, and it is actually, if any child really thinks about what this prayer says, perhaps one might arrive at the conclusion that it should not be taught to children, because it really is the image that every morning is a resurrection. Every morning is a revival, and it requires divine compassion in order for it to happen. It raises the question of that it might not happen, right? And that for which we can be grateful. So on the one hand, it means that you start your day with gratitude, which is a wonderful way to start your day, but also with a frisson, with a little shudder. Wow, I'm so glad that I'm awake, and I thank God I'm awake. I had a friend who had a very, very serious operation about a month ago, and he said that when he woke up after the operation, he doesn't remember it, but he said his wife said to him that the first thing he said when he opens his eyes is, I made it. He didn't take it for granted. He had open heart surgery. Did not take it for granted. He said, I made it. And in a way, the Modeh Ani is really that same idea. I made it. Why? Well, in his case, probably he thanked the skill of his surgeons. But here it's divine compassion, b'chemla, divine compassion. Great is your faithfulness. And remember that verse, because we're going to see it more than once as we go forward. Okay, now, again, the goal of tonight is to, in a way, to show you how deep this is, things that people don't even notice. Even people who pray all the daily prayers 3 times a day, they often don't even really hear what they're saying, or they don't take it seriously enough in order to understand the gravity of what they're saying. This is from the Amidah, the silent standing prayer, which observant Jews, or the most observant Jews, recite at least 3 times a day. It's the centerpiece of the liturgy. They recite at least 3 times a day, 4 times on the Sabbath, 5 times in Yom Kippur, and it is a very familiar thing to people who do the daily prayers. This is the second paragraph of the second blessing, and it is a really grave prayer. But as is true with many of our gravest prayers, it's been kind of domesticated with nice tunes that don't quite match up to the gravity of the words. And for people who are attend synagogue regularly or even not regularly, you might be familiar. It goes like this. Ba-da-bum, bum, 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 ba-da-bum, ba-dum, bum, 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 like that. Okay? And it's Michakel Chayim Bechesed, Michaye Metim Berachamim Rabim. Now, what does those words mean that I just sang? Well, let's look at them. You are eternally mighty, Lord. You revive the dead. You have great power to save. In the winter, actually now we say, you make the wind blow and the rain fall. In the summer, you say you bring the dew. You sustain the living with kindness. You revive the dead with great compassion. That's the thing that we just sang. You sustain the living with kindness. You revive the dead with great compassion. You revive the dead. You revive the dead. That's really the centerpiece of this paragraph. And the fact that it's recited with this kind of jaunty tune, in a way, it's, I think a psychoanalyst would have lied to say about that. It domesticates it, that this is really about death and the possibility of resurrection. You support the fallen, you heal the sick, you set the captives free, you keep faith with those who sleep in the dust. In other words, those who are dead. Who is like you, mighty one? Who resembles you? King who kills and gives life. Melech meimit u'mechaye. And again, something that, if you really think about the portrayal of God here, the jaunty tune begins to seem out of place and makes salvation blossom. Who is like you? You are faithful to revive the dead. Blessed are you, Hashem, who revives the dead. Now, this revival of the dead is stated actually 4 times, although here it's in the second to last line, it's in the infinitive, but the phrase who revives the dead is actually stated 3 times. And as I say, really pious Jews recite this at least 3 times a day, and actually hear it 6 times a day because they recite it themselves. And then if they're in the synagogue, or 5 times a day, because then 2 of those prayer services, the prayer leader also recites it. And here's a commentary on this blessing from a very important commentator on Jewish prayers named David Abu Draham or Abu Darham, I'm not really sure exactly how the correct way of pronouncing it, who wrote in the early 14th century in Spain, an amazing book for people interested in the prayers. I don't think it's been translated, unfortunately, as yet. But I translated this passage. So this is about the paragraph we just read. This blessing, in other words, the second blessing of the Amidah, mentions the revival of the dead, Tchiat HaMetim, 3 times. Actually, it's 4 times, but the phrase Mechayeh Metim occurs 3 times. And listen to what he says. And the way in which the resurrection of the dead gets integrated into life. It gets integrated. It doesn't become a mere metaphor, but it also becomes embroidered in a broader way of living. For the Blessed Holy One revives the dead in 3 contexts. And I've tried to make this a pretty literal translation. The first is when a person sleeps in bed, and is considered to be like one who is dead. And a person says, in your hands I entrust my spirit. And that's a phrase from Psalms, chapter 31 of Psalms, Tehillim, and it's also more familiar to people from the song Adon Olam, Biyadcha Afkid Ruchi. And the song Adon Olam, although people are mostly familiar with it from the synagogue, is actually traditionally recited before going to sleep. And you can see why, because of this last line, which is a quote from a verse, in your hands I entrust my spirit. And actually the last lines of Adon Olam is Biyadcha Afkid Ruchi Beit Ishan Ve'ira. In your hands I entrust my spirit when I go to sleep and when I awaken. And with my spirit, my body, I entrust to God. God is mine and I will not fear. Okay, so a person says, in your hands I trust my spirit. This is the idea that going to sleep is a kind of death. And the Blessed Holy One raises clouds and brings down dew and rain. And that he's referring to those other elements of that blessing to sustain the person while they're sleeping and to return their soul. The miracle of going to sleep and remaining alive and being resurrected in some significant sense upon awakening. That's the first context. He's trying to explain why it's mentioned 3 times. The second is the descent of the rains. This is unexpected, right? As it says in the Talmud, I can't remember the exact site is, Rabbi Abahu says, the day of the rains is greater than the revival of the dead at the end of days. For the revival of the dead is only for the righteous and not the wicked, as it says, quoting a verse from Daniel, again, one of the places where that seems to allude to the resurrection of the dead. Many of those that sleep in the dust of the earth will awake, some to eternal life, others to reproaches, to everlasting abhorrence. So the idea is that when the dead reawaken at the end of days, some will continue to live forever and others will be either condemned to hell or maybe just be annihilated. It's a little bit unclear in Daniel, a very poetic book. While the rains are for the righteous and the wicked. Very interesting saying from the Talmud that divine beneficence on both the righteous and the wicked is greater than divine beneficence just for the righteous. And really just come to say that the Abu Draham says the descent of the rains on the earth should be understood as a kind of revival of the dead. Maybe it's the idea of a revival of the dead earth. And certainly in our era of threatening a planetary catastrophe, this idea that the rains are necessary, that the earth, we shouldn't take the life of the earth for granted, is perhaps even more alive for us than it has been for many centuries. And the third, he says, it relates to the revival of the dead in the future to come, at the end of days, as we seal the blessing with, that's a typo, blessed are you who revives the dead. So it's really at the end that it's really, and he says, and that's the main thing in this blessing. But he says it's really 3 things. Waking up from sleep, the descent of the rains as a revival of, I presume, of the dead earth, and then finally, the revival of the dead at the end of days. So the resurrection of the dead, he certainly believes in it literally, but he's also saying it's part of a broader vision, a broader religious vision, really. And one could almost say that his description of this blessing is really an entire religious vision in his discussion of this second blessing of the Amidah, again, something that is familiar to anyone who does Jewish prayer. You know what I think? I think that I'm going to pause for questions because the last thing I want to do is a text from the Zohar. But why don't I pause here and see if anybody has questions that we could discuss briefly before I turn to the last thing we're going to do. Anyone? Questions? If not, I'll just...
If you're here, you can feel free to unmute or raise your hand and I'll help you out. I actually have kind of a question-ish thing. It's probably more in the comment territory, if that's all right.
Also good.
But I was thinking about this idea of, I mean, it was a series of thoughts, I'll put it that way, but the idea of making the blessing about, one who revives the dead when you see someone after a long while. And this kind of tension between legalistic or rationalist Jewish ideas and these ideas that we have plenty of text about, but don't always come into play Jewishly. Just thinking about the types of testimony and witness necessary to prove that a woman's husband is dead, in order for her to be unchained as an aguna, and seeing, you know, this again, like, create some tension for me. Like, why would I make that blessing, you know, when I wouldn't have had any proof that this person were dead otherwise? Like, if there were, you know, sufficient reason to believe maybe this person died at sea, or had some sort of, you know, other issue, then I could see maybe making that blessing. But if it's just, we didn't have Twitter, so I hadn't heard about that person since I physically last saw that person last, like, I feel like that steps into the territory of, like, is this, you know, a blessing made in vain? So I just thought that was interesting.
It's an amazing comment. I mean, I think that it raises both very specific, urgent questions about the topic of aguna, that are obviously really pressing, urgent, almost life and death questions for many, 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 many people. Certainly questions about, you know, basic happiness and freedom. It also raises broader philosophical questions about the relationship between law and lore, storytelling, religious vision in the Jewish tradition generally. Yeah, I mean, and on that broader thing, right? In the Talmud, you know, you don't get the idea that the Talmudic sages saw the storytelling, the agadot, and the visions and the religiosity as separate from their. Wait, can you hear me? Okay, because I got some kind of message that said my session ended. I don't know why. Anyway, you get the sense that for them, this was one piece. They could shift from legal discussions to storytelling to some kind of religious vision, and there's no necessarily marker of it. But the more rigid division between, say, halacha and agadah, between law and lore, legend, religious stories, that really becomes only later after the Talmud, and really under the influence of philosophy, and comes to a climax with Maimonides in the 12th century. But I think you make a really great point, right? If you haven't seen somebody for 12 months, you can make a blessing of blessed is God who revives the dead, and as Noah hinted at here, the idea of making a blessing in vain is a very grave matter in Judaism. So if they say you should make this blessing, they must think it's appropriate. Because making a blessing, a bracha levatala, is the halachic phrase. A blessing in vain is really a grave thing, and actually, it's even graver in the Sephardic tradition. I mean, it's really a very grave matter. This matter of making an unnecessary blessing, and how that was just brilliant, Noah. I mean, the more I think about what you just said, the more brilliant it was, and how does it relate to this very strict stringencies about proving death, and the ensuing problems of aguna. That's really an amazing point. How do we integrate? What is that relationship between these visions and the everyday life? You know, I was what I was trying to do tonight, and what I'm trying to do tonight is to show how the everyday practice of Judaism has all these really powerful religious visions in them that many people, even people who say these prayers every day, don't even realize what they're saying. And if you say, well, what about the resurrection of the dead? Do you really believe in that? I say, yeah. Well, if they're Orthodox, they probably say, yeah, of course I do. But I don't think they let it bother them too much. They haven't integrated into their experience of life. And what I'm trying to do tonight, and in this course of these successions, is try to figure out whether or not you say, do you believe in it? Oh, yeah, or not. how to integrate these ideas into an experience of life. And tonight, especially an experience of wonder, and maybe also a certain experience of terror, but certainly not taking things for granted. You see a friend say, blessed are you who revives the dead, right? Wake up in the morning. Blessed are you who restores souls to dead corpses. Okay, I'm going to then move on to a passage from the Zohar, a wonderful passage that I think brings together some of the themes I'm developing. Now, the Zohar, for people who are unfamiliar, I know that some of you on this call are familiar with it, but those of you who don't know what it is, the Zohar is a vast collection of kabbalistic texts that began circulating the late 13th century in Spain. They're written in Aramaic. They are written in a highly literary style, a highly literary form of Aramaic. They tell the stories of a group of sages whose names are familiar to us from the Talmudic era, mostly 2nd century sages, and records their wanderings around. They're wandering around, and as they're wandering around, they're telling each other about the deepest mysteries of God. They're reading verses from the Bible and explaining how these verses from the Bible conceal incredible mystical mysteries. They also develop a very elaborate mythology in which, although we think of Judaism, or Judaism is said to be a monotheism, which I'm sure it is, in Kabbalah there are also several different personae, several different divine personae, at least 5 of them, and probably an infinite number. And of course, it's always said they're actually one, but much of the Zohar is about the dramas of the movement towards unification of these divine personae, and in particular of 2 of them, who are known as the Blessed Holy One and the Shekhinah. They're a male-female couple, and the dramas of their separation and reunification is really at the heart of the Zoharic vision of history, of the cosmos, of God, of everything, and perhaps most importantly for us, of the practice of Judaism. The goal of the practice of Judaism is to bring these 2 divine figures together, and the dangers of not doing the right thing is that it has a damaging effect on the divine. Now, I'm just going to state it right out there for people who've never heard anything kabbalistic before and have been taught some other form of Judaism. This might come as a complete shock. Just bear with me. Just assume that what I'm saying is accurate for the moment. You might having the feeling of, that doesn't sound like Judaism, and that's fine. But just know that it was at the heart of most Jews' visions of Judaism for several centuries, and still is for many broad strands of Jewish life today, certainly in the Hasidic world. Also in the other end, perhaps at the other end, if we view the Hasidic world as the most ultra-Orthodox, or one of the most ultra-Orthodox, then all the way at the other end of the Jewish world, in Jewish renewal, and further in Kohenet, the Kabbalistic visions are very much also at the center. So without giving a whole thing about that, I want to just move to this story, which is on our theme, and is also, now that I think about it, actually a quite good exemplification of some of the more general things I said about the Zohar. So this is from the Zohar. Again, it's written in Aramaic, not in Hebrew, and it's partly to make it seem as though it's from the land of Israel in the 2nd century, where the vernacular was Aramaic, and partly it's because it sounds more mysterious, because it's more unfamiliar. Okay, so that's Aramaic, and here we go. Rabbi Shimon, and Rabbi Shimon, the son of Yochai, is the sort of the central stage of the entire operation. Rabbi Shimon was, and there's a very, very typical opening. They're always wandering around, chatting, and having miracles happen to them. Rabbi Shimon was traveling from Cappadocia to Lydda, accompanied by Rabbi Yehuda. As they were going, Rabbi Pinchas, the son of Yair, was coming from the other direction, and he didn't see them yet, with two men goading his donkey behind them. They always have these donkey tenders with them, and sometimes the donkey tenders turn out to be great sages, sort of hidden sages. Not so much in this story, but in other stories. Rabbi Pinchas's donkey stood still. They goaded him, but he did not move, the donkey. And it's sort of, people familiar with the Bible know that this is sort of, in a way, an evocation of the story of Bilam or Balaam in the Bible, although Balaam's a bad guy and Rabbi Pinchas is a good guy. It's a very interesting usage of this biblical reference. Let's see what happens. So he's going, his donkey stops, and he doesn't know why. But Rabbi Pinchas and the two donkey drivers are like hitting the donkey. And Rabbi Pinchas said, let him be, let the donkey be. For he must have smelled the scent of new faces. Donkey, he attributes to the donkey the secret wisdom. The donkey smells the scent of new faces. And for the Aramaicists among you, it's recha de anpin chadetin. And it sounds really cool in Aramaic. Anpin chadetin, new faces. Or a miracle is about to be performed for us. And you get the feeling of these sages living in a magical universe in which donkeys have secret insight that people don't have, or they can announce or augur a possible miracle. While they were there, so they were trying to figure out what to do, Rabbi Shimon emerged from behind a rock. The donkey began to move. Rabbi Pinchas said to them, he said to his donkey drivers, didn't I tell you that he smelled the scent of new faces? It's like this miracle. Like he's walking in the road and Rabbi Shimon appears. That's a miracle. Just see your teacher, see your old friend. It's a miracle. It's that idea of not taking anything for granted. Rabbi Pinchas dismounted and embraced him, weeping. He said to him, I saw in a dream that the Shekhinah, that's this female divine figure, was coming to me and giving me great presents. And I rejoiced in her. And this is personal relationship with this divine figure, this female divine figure often portrayed as a divine mother. Now look, just as I saw. And this experience of seeing an old friend and seeing the divine in your old friend, in this case, his son-in-law, Pinchas ben Yair is described in the Talmud and the Zohar, in one of them as his son-in-law and one of them as his father-in-law, and I can never remember which is which, but it doesn't really matter here. He sees this, his teacher, his relative, his old friend, and what he sees in him is the face of the divine. And in particular, interestingly enough, the face of the female divine. That's what he sees in his friend's face. Rabbi Shimon said, from the sound of your donkey's hooves, I knew it was you. So they both had this sort of mystical intimation of the other's presence, of the other's coming. Now joy is complete. Why? Because we're together. And the Zohar is all about love between divine figures, love between human beings, as that nothing is complete. You're not a complete person unless you're in relationship to another, and that applies to God as well as to human beings. Rabbi Pinchas says, let us sit down somewhere. Since words of Torah require thirsting clarity. An interesting word here. It's actually one word in the Aramaic, tzahuta. They found a spring of water in a tree and sat down. Rabbi Pinchas said, I was reflecting that in the revival of the dead, right? And then I put an ellipsis here because it goes on for a while, right? And it turns out this is a classic thing in the Zohar where the frame story, the story that's being told about the sages, then turns out to be intimately connected with the subject matter of their discussions. So he sees his friend that he hasn't seen in a long time, and he says, wow, I see God in you. And this is also something of an evocation of that Talmudic passage written 1,000 years earlier about when you see your friend you haven't seen for a long time, you say, blessed is God who revives the dead. So then several pages or, a couple pages follow in between. And then Rabbi Shimon says this about the revival of the dead, the resurrection of the dead. The mystery of the word is this. And the word could be the mystery of the matter. It's the raza de mila. Mystery of the word is this. The word meaning the revival of the dead. Now listen to what he says here. All souls of the righteous are treasured away and concealed beneath the king's throne. And he's talking about the souls of the righteous who have died. And she preserves them to restore them to their place. And again, this is a very poetic way of saying that the souls of the righteous dead are preserved and will eventually be restored in the time of the resurrection of the dead. She, and who's this she? The king's matronita. Matronita is a word deriving from Latin. Matron, matrona, can mean the queen or the great lady, and here it refers to the Shekhinah, the female consort of the Blessed Holy One. She, the king's matronita, in whose hands all spirits are entrusted, as it is written, in your hand I entrust my spirit, and she preserves them. So when we say, in Adon Olam, bi'adcha avkid ruchi, in your hand I entrust my spirit, also recited, supposed to be recited before you go to sleep at night, also interestingly enough, traditionally recited at a deathbed. You recite the Adon Olam, and in particular, because of this verse, in your hand I entrust my spirit. Bi'adcha avkid ruchi. And Adon Olam is another song that has very grave meaning, but is often sung to silly tunes in the synagogue, I think in a way to domesticate it. Right, so what happens with death is the souls of the righteous get entrusted into the hand of the Shekhinah, this female divine figure, the queen. In the same manner, King David, who's the legendary author of the book of Psalms, preserve my soul, for I am faithful. Preserve? The king's matronita who preserves my soul because I am faithful. And there's an interesting thing here. Everywhere the word I is written, without qualification, this is matronita. This refers to the Shekhinah. Various pronouns refer to various divine figures, and the ani is the word that's most often associated with the Shekhinah. Right? So I am faithful. Who is faithful? The Shekhinah. As we say in Modeh Ani, thank you for restoring my soul. Great is your faithfulness. This is the Shekhinah who's faithful. What is she faithful for? For preserving our souls to return them at the time of the resurrection of the dead. Rabbi Pinchas wept and said, didn't I tell you that Shekhinah gave me presents and gifts? And the word, the verb here is in the past tense, gave me, not willingly, but gave me. Happy is my share that I've seen you and heard this. Right? And this wraps up, there's a beautiful little passage because it wraps up. It's a perfect, in a way, intro to Zohar. Why? Because you have a frame story, right? He sees they're wandering, he sees his friend. It's a miracle I've seen my friend. A miracle. I see God in my friend, right? And not only God, but the female divine figure, it's a present. The seeing of my friend is a present from the Shekhinah, from this female divine figure. And he says, you know what I was thinking about? Just happened to be thinking about the resurrection of the dead, just happened to be. And then Rabbi Shimon gives this homily at the end and says, you know what? This is how it works. The souls of the righteous are hidden away under the throne of God, right? And the throne of God is another name for the Shekhinah. Just like Rabbi Shimon, remember? He was hidden behind the rock, remember? Maybe that rock is the throne of God, right? And she preserves them until the time comes to restore it, when she restores it to it, and that's this great present to receive from the Shekhinah, which I dreamed. I, Pinchas ben Yair, had this dream that I was going to get a present. And it turns out I did get a present from the Shekhinah because I saw Rabbi Shimon, and I will get a present from the Shekhinah at the time of the resurrection of the dead. So a perfect story about integrating this idea of the resurrection of the dead into one's daily life and to experience what might seem like a very quotidian, banal happening. Walking on the road, I see a friend of mine. And to experience that, not to take that for granted, but to experience that as a resurrection of the dead, and conversely, to anticipate the resurrection of the dead at the end of days as something that you believe in or trust in or experience will happen just as you experience this kind of quotidian event of meeting your friend on the road and having that moment. And I see it's exactly 9 p.m. So I'm happy to stay and chat. For those who have to leave, this is the end of the it's listed from 8 to 9. So, but I'm happy to stay in chat if that's okay with Drisha. Noah, is it okay? I'm happy to stay on the screen. And for those of you who are going away, I hope you had a good time tonight. And I hope to see you next week when we'll do more of this and ever more mind-blowing things as we go along in our journey. So good night to those who are leaving. And for those of you who stay, please stay. And I'm happy to chat about whatever until whenever. Anyone have any questions or comments or?
You can feel free to unmute or raise your physical hand if you're on camera, or your little virtual hand, or put something in the chat and I'll do my best to help out.
And if not, we can just there's plenty of food for thought. So there's a comment in the chat, any references to resurrection in the Torah? Well, that's an interesting question. And maybe I'll give some of these passages next time. So in the Torah or the Tanakh, there are a couple of verses which seem to indicate something like it. So here are some examples. Well, there is actually 2 instances of actual resurrection of the dead in the Hebrew Bible, in the Tanakh. One performed by the prophet Elijah, one performed by the prophet Elisha. These are actually instances of the resurrection of the dead. In terms of the resurrection of the dead at the end of days, that's a little bit more complicated. So you have this vision of Ezekiel, and it's a little bit unclear, or let's put it this way, it seems like maybe the way it appears in Ezekiel, it's really talking about the restoration of the Jewish people, not so much about the resurrection of the dead, but the coming to life of the dry bones as a metaphor. It's possible that that's how Ezekiel meant it, of the revival of the Jewish people after destruction. Ezekiel is a prophet who lived at the time of the destruction of the first temple, and was in exile in Babylonia. But on the other hand, people have read that story later as one of the proofs for resurrection of the dead at the end of days in the Bible. There's a verse in Isaiah that perhaps suggests in that way. Usually when academics talk about it, they say it's really in the book of Daniel, and that verse that I read that says that suggests the emerging idea among Jews of the idea of the resurrection of the dead at the end of days. And the book of Daniel was written probably in the, 2nd century before the Common Era. Really one of the latest books of the Tanakh. And the ideas are really emerging then, and they're emerging in a variety of writings from that era. And then eventually by the time of the Mishnah, which is a couple of hundred years later, it's a fundamental belief. And if you don't believe in it, you're a heretic. And it's like not believing the Torah. So I'd say the reference to the book of Daniel is perhaps the clearest reference to it. Now, in the Talmud, because they really believe in this, they constantly try to prove that it's in the Bible. And they quote all kinds of verses to prove it. And these proofs, you may find them more or less persuasive. They may have meant them more or less seriously as actual proof texts. They often involve very, very close readings of specific words or grammatical oddities. I'll give you a very quick example, would be a sort of a well-known passage in the Bible, because it's part of the daily liturgy. It's the Song of the Sea. And it begins, Az Yashir Moshe B'nai Israel. Then, and the translation is usually, then Moses and the Israelites sang. And then a long song follows. And certainly parts of it are by academic biblical scholars often view that as some of the oldest passages in the Bible. Now, what I'm translating is, then Moses sang. If you want to read it, if you look at it grammatically, the word for sang, actually, if you take it out of the verse, it actually is the future tense, will sing. And so that's one of the verses. They say, then Moses will sing. When will he sing it? At the end of days, right? Now, probably in context, it doesn't mean that. And I don't want to give a whole grammar lesson now, but it's the kind of verse that they cite. And there's a whole bunch of things like that. And the relevance of it is not so much whether you believe their proofs or not. The relevance of it, I think, is it became central to what we think of as Judaism, basically rabbinic Judaism. There were other Jews at the time who didn't believe in it. The Sadducees didn't believe in it. But the Pharisees, who were the forerunners of the rabbis, really believed in it, and trying to root it in the Bible was really, really important to them. For people to know a little about the New Testament, this controversy is actually this controversy between the Pharisees and Sadducees appears in the New Testament too, because Jesus was much closer to the Pharisees. I mean, even though he had a lot of bad things to say about the Pharisees, he was very much in that zone. He was in the Pharisee world, and resurrection of the dead at the end of the days is not only of Jesus, but of everyone, is fundamental in early Christian theology, absolutely fundamental. The resurrection of everyone, not just Jesus, after the crucifixion. And it's that Pharisee influence. He's really from that same milieu that produced the Talmud, despite his fraught relationship with them. And it's fundamental in early Islam, which happens much later, obviously, in the 6th century, but in the 7th century. But fundamental in early Islamic theology, absolutely fundamental. And the downplaying of this in modern times in all three religions is really a product of trying not to sound too unscientific and too superstitious, not too magical, but really fundamental, really, really fundamental. And saying that if you deny that the resurrection of the dead is in the Torah, you're a heretic, and you have no share in the world to come. And I give you other passages from the Talmud that you're going to go to hell in the worst possible way, right? So it was really, really important. And again, what I'm trying to do tonight is to give you the sense of how you can make it into a life, how it integrates into a life. Religious Jews often say, if you say, how are you doing? They'll say, Baruch Hashem, thank God, right? And it's sort of a mark of maybe living in that, in the very religious world, is you say a lot of Baruch Hashems in your daily life. How you doing, Baruch Hashem? How's the peanut butter sandwich? Baruch Hashem, right? How is your case of COVID? Baruch Hashem, not too bad. I mean, people say these things all the time, and I'm not sure how much they hear them when they say, I assume many people do. But for these guys to say, Baruch Hashem mechayei hametim, it seemed to be just part of their repertoire to say, Baruch Hashem mechayei hametim, right? I have a group that studies Zohar with me. We've been going at it for more than 10 years. And when COVID started, we went on Zoom, obviously. And the very first time that we met again in person, we said Shechianu. We recited the bracha Shechianu. But later on, I thought, we should have said Baruch Hashem v'chayei hametim, because we were all seeing each other for the first time. And it was a really kind of a beautiful thing. See this in the chat here. Somebody says, I really like your comparison of Rashbi emerging from the rock. Oh, Jesse. I know Jesse we have exchanges often on Facebook. He says, I really like your comparison of Rashbi emerging behind the rock to greet Rabbi Pinchas and souls emerging from under the divine. Can you say more about it, please? The main, what immediately came to mind, Jesse, when you said that? Can I say more about it? I want to say, wow, that's really what I want to say about it. It's one of those moments. It's one of those perfectly constructed passages in the Zohar. The people who wrote the Zohar were many of them were very highly, operating at a very high literary level. And some passages in the Zohar have these perfect structures in which the frame story about what these sages are doing, and then the content of their, sort of homilies, of their discussions, perfectly reflect each other. And this is one of these stories, right? Where Rabbi Shimon appears behind the rock and he says, wow, it's a present from the Shekhinah. And then it turns out the present from the Shekhinah is the Rav. It's just as grand when Rabbi Shimon comes out of the rock as when the dead are resurrected at the end of days. They're the same. They're both presence of the Shekhinah. And they're both miraculous, right? I mean, to live that way, right, is like an amazing thing. To be able to live at that level of gratitude, Modeh Ani, to live at the level of gratitude and wonder and not taking things for granted, is just. I tell a very short story. I was once a friend of mine from Israel, who's another academic Kabbalah scholar, a brilliant guy named Yonatan Ben Arosh. I always think of him as a young man, but I've known him now for, 10 years, and he's not as young as he used to be, unlike me. But we're wandering around the Upper West Side, right? We're talking about the Zohar. He's an amazing Zohar scholar, really amazing. Some stuff in English, he's really great, a fine person. And we're walking down the street on Columbus Avenue, and there I see walking towards us is this man, Tzvi Padeh, alav shalom. I don't know if anybody of you know that name. Tzvi Padeh was a very modest, unassuming man who went to the Carlebach Shul. He was, by the time I knew him, he was a fairly old man, big beard, very modest, right? He looked like a Jew walking down the street, but he actually translated. He was also very, very learned, and he produced this wonderful translation of a crucial part of Luriana Kabbalah, of this book, the Eitz Chaim, one of the main works of Luriana Kabbalah, and he published this major translation of a part of it with a commentary, an amazing thing, very unassuming. And I'm walking down the street with Yonatan Ben Arosh, my fellow academic Kabbalah scholar, and I see this this guy was almost like a hidden tzaddik, right? A Kabbalah scholar who's, probably most people don't even know his name, though many people have this great book. And I said, Yonatan, you're not going to believe this. Who's walking toward us? You see that guy who looks like a Pashut Yid, a plain Jew walking down the street? He translated the Eitz Chaim. It was really like one of those moments that it was a very Zoharic moment, right? Then I should have said Baruch Hashem Achayim. Now that Tzvi Padeh died some time ago, and I actually like the fact that I haven't thought about him now for a long time, but just to say his name, I think is a schut here. Wait, I see somebody else has a thing in the chat I want to say. Perhaps next session, can we discuss the implications, possibility of taking these texts seriously? As a student of Wissenschaft, I appreciate these texts, but as a religious person living in a rationalistic world, I don't know what to make of these texts. I don't know you, but I'm teaching this course for you. Thank you. I hope nobody thinks that I planted you here, right? But it's actually I'm teaching this course for you. It's you that I'm teaching the course for that question, right? Is what would it mean to take them seriously while not losing one's credibility as a plausible person walking around in consumer society, right? And I think that really taking it seriously in their existential implications is really what I want here. No matter what you end up saying, believing, as it were, that's not less important than what's the vision here? What's the vision here? And I love that passage from Abu Draham is, you say this second blessing of the Amidah, and you have in mind waking up every morning, greeting the rain, and anticipating resurrection of the dead at the end of the days. It's part of a vision. It's part of one vision, right? And in a way, it's like to believe the resurrection of the dead in an isolated way seems artificial and weird and superstitious. But if it's part of an overall vision in which you experience it all the time, you know, when your friend comes from behind a rock, or Sri Padel passes you on the street, then it's not. Then it's actually part of your life. Then it's actually part of your life. I think you could say the same thing about God, for that matter. That God is a belief. Do you believe in God? It's like, no, I believe in God. I mean, like, as a belief, it almost seems absurd as a question, right? But do you live God? That's not so absurd, right? And here I would say it's partly a response to your comment. The word for belief in Hebrew is emunah, right? And Maimonides talks a lot about emunah. And he says you have to believe, you know, and famously he said you have to believe these 13 things, right? And certainly from Maimonides, the things that these 13 things, they don't care if you believe in them or not. They'll be true. And actually, the first one actually says it. You could exist, you could not exist, this thing will still be true. So you have to believe in them, but they don't have to believe in you, or they don't really care if you exist or not. I mean, I'm somewhat caricaturing Maimonides, but I like to do that because it makes the Zohar more clear, even though I know I'm not doing him justice. In the Zohar, the Aramaic word for emunah is mehemnuta, right? And mehemnuta is simply the Aramaic translation of emunah, of faith. And it almost always appears in the Zohar in the conjunction raza de mehemnuta, the mystery of faith. Now, when the Zohar says the mystery of faith, they're never, as far as I know, I mean, I haven't done a complete search, but I've never come upon a place where it is something that you have to believe in that Maimonidean way. It's never about, I believe in X, and the X doesn't care about whether I exist or not, right? I believe that, 2 + 2 = 4, right? It's, as far as I know, never used in that way. It's always used as, what is mehemnuta? What is faith? It's about a process. It's about a process of unification. What is the mystery of faith? A process of unification that human beings participate in, right? So sometimes it's used to describe the process of unification of the various elements of the divine figures. Sometimes it's used as a description of the human participation in helping that process of unification, what academic scholars call theurgy, Theurgy. And if you just do a word search in the Zohar, look at where they use this phrase, it's always talking about a process, not about an assent to a proposition, right? And I think that's true of these things too, that it's clear the people in the Talmud and certainly the Kabbalists, they lived the resurrection of the dead. They lived it in their lives, right? I'm sure they would sign a statement. Do you think it's actually going to happen? I'm sure they would all say, yes, of course. But I think much more important was that they lived it in their lives. And it's also true of gilgul, reincarnation. They lived it in their lives. And then the issue of its literal truth becomes in a way secondary. I mean, I'm sure they all say, yes, of course, I'll sign that. I'll write an affidavit, sign it. But thank you for that question, Ariel, and I really hope you come back, because I designed it with you in mind, even though this is the first time I'm seeing you. Anyone else?
This is your last chance, because I'm about to wrap things up.
Okay, we're about to wrap things up, so we could just, anyone want to say anything? Okay.
I want to give the little goodbye spiel. So thank you, Dr. Berman, as always, for a wonderful class, and all of you for participating in our learning community. We do still have a dozen other classes on the schedule for this week, so you're very welcome to check some other classes out if you would like. I would like to mention a few in particular because they have some touch points with this class. We have a class on Wednesday night looking at heretics. So if you like this idea of defining what a heretic is and thinking about how you do or don't relate to that, perhaps consider that. And on Thursday night, this might sound a little out there, but I view it as a very strong counterpoint, friend of this class in a way, because we're also looking at something that is very much a part of our language and liturgical life as Jews, but people don't like thinking about or talking about, and that is slavery. And the first class was amazing. So it's a difficult class for sure, but I think very, very enriching. So if you're up for it, I encourage you to join us on Thursday night for that. And you can learn more, as always, at drisha.org, at 5783.drisha.org, at drisha.org/classes, etc. We are findable. And I look forward to learning with everyone here again soon. Be well.
And thanks to everyone for participating. Bye-bye.